Next from Chicago, at the Elmhurst College 8th Annual Governmental Forum, Senator Mark Kirk discusses with Chicago Tribune editorial page editor Bruce Dold his thoughts on the U.S.-Iran nuclear deal, his criticism of Indiana's recently passed RFRA law, what the Republican Party needs in a presidential candidate, and the process of recovering from his stroke. This runs about 30 minutes.
Mr. Dold, you're on.
Thank you, Lee. Nice to see you, Senator. As the lights dimmed down, Senator leaned in. He said, "There must be a Democrat in the room." So, yeah, it's DuPage County. It's not like it used to be. So let's talk about a Democrat. Let's get right into it. You are in the middle of one of the most key national security issues of our age, Iran nuclear weapons. Jan Schakowsky, the Congresswoman, this week sharply criticized you, called for an apology for making a connection to what's happening today to the late 1930s, saying comparing the Obama administration to Nazi appeasement is an outrage. Is it an outrage?
I'm not going to apologize. I'm going to not flinch on this. I would say if you technically look at the 1938 record, Neville Chamberlain actually got out of Hitler a commitment not to take Czechoslovakia. That's a pretty significant achievement, and he waived that piece of paper. We now have peace in our time. He could not have been more wrong at that time. I would say the Obama administration's got a lot less than Chamberlain got from Iran.
There seems, with this deal, there's a lot we don't know about it. There are a lot of questions about it. When would sanctions actually come off? Is there a prospect for a deal that you think that you would support that would be ironclad enough to take away the threat?
That's why I had the slide on Nelson Mandela. The South African agreement is the model for disarming from nuclear weaponry. Anytime, anywhere, no notice inspections is the way to go. Mm-hmm. That should be very acceptable to the U.S.
So how would that look in an Iran kind of deal? Would it require
There is one technical problem. I talked to Ali Hanonen, who is the most experienced nuclear investigator. He said, "Mark, you have to understand that the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Administration, can only inspect those facilities which are declared." It's as if you could call the Naperville police and say, "You can I don't care what the search warrant says. You can only search what in my house is declared to be illegal."
Mm-hmm. He has pointed out, and others have too, that there are 12 fundamental questions that Iran hasn't answered.
Right.
What would those questions, and what would we learn if Iran were to come clean on that, and how far would that take us to something that would be an acceptable deal?
The key is the future of the Fordow facility, where the president himself even said to hollow out a mountain and put a bunch of uranium cascades is not essential for a civilian nuclear power program. And the president, in his lecture to the Sabin Forum, he highlighted that Fordow should not exist. In my view, it should not exist. Mm-hmm.
And do you see any prospect in these negotiations?
As it turns out, I don't think the Iranians are going to give up a single centrifuge. This agreement doesn't block the Iranian path to a nuclear weapon. It paves the road for it, just like Prime Minister Netanyahu told the Congress.
Mm-hmm. The deal does, I believe, reduce the number of operating centrifuges, no? But you don't think they would actually live up to it?
With inadequate, remember, Ali reminded me that inspections are only with like 10 days notice or 24 hours notice. A so-called snap inspection is a 24 hours notice. For those who are experienced in the drywall business, you always know how fast you could put up a wall and just say to the inspectors, "Oh, there's nothing. Don't look at that guy behind the curtain," just like we saw in the Wizard of Oz.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So what are the prospects in Congress now? There's Kirk Menendez, which would enhance sanctions. There are prospects for
the long run, the question is, how do we make sure that our children never see a nuclear war in the Persian Gulf? In that sense, there's a unique alliance here that can form between the Senate and the government of France. The French government is absolutely outstanding on this question. The French Foreign Minister Hollande, his name is actually Laurent Fabius, has oftentimes said that the Americans are not strong enough on a verification of Iranian commitments. Once we see this deal fall apart, which I think is going to happen soon, the Senate should be a brooding presence over these negotiations, willing to go ahead with sanctions to make sure that we can use the vast economic power of the United States, $14 trillion economy, against a little $30 billion economy of Iran. We should understand that we are the big boy in the block, and we should always try to meet our security needs with non-military means.
We met with the French foreign minister last year, and he was really pretty blunt about what he expects or doesn't expect from the U.S. I mean, we asked him who's going to hold it around to the fire, and he said, well, why? We asked him, why is France so strong on this? He said, well, somebody has to, and the implication that the U.S. wouldn't. But France apparently is on board with this deal, isn't it?
They've been part of the P5+1. I think when the Obama administration brought in Russia and China, the other parties participated simply for the intelligence value. If the Americans are going to invite you into the room, you might as well send your best intel agent in the room to tell everybody exactly what's happening back in Beijing and Moscow.
But if France, if Germany, if Britain, if Russia and China are on board with this and the U.S. turns it down, what are the prospects that the world stays with us on sanctions?
I think my experience with Menendez Kirk is instructive. I remember we had one key bank in China that had about $5 billion worth of Iranian reales. We said to them, with the State Department's help, I would say that the administration is so locked down they would never start imposing sanctions like this. We said to, I think it was called Pudong Bank in Shanghai, if you ever want to deal with the $14 trillion economy of the U.S., or do you do, then you got to lock up this $5 billion deposit. Once the market figured out what was happening to all this locked up Iranian money, it lost confidence in the value of the Iranian real. So the huge power of the United States, we have to, to take on Tchaikovsky a little bit. In the case of World War II, we promised ourselves never again. Never again means remembering the lessons of how World War II started. There's a great conversation between Churchill and Roosevelt on the Scrambler when Churchill asked Roosevelt, what do we call this new conflict? Churchill answered Roosevelt, he said, well, let's call it the unnecessary conflict, the one that we could have stopped. That the history of a good diplomacy is one of democracy sticking together, standing up for the freedom of individuals. I would say you should know the Iranians for who they are. I have teamed up with the log cabin Republicans. They are the gay part of the Republican Party. They are taking out ads that show a pair of shoes hanging in the air, highlighting the 900 gay Iranians that they have hung in that country. We should understand that that is the character of the regime that we're dealing with, who are going to, let me just divert for a second, talk about if Iran gets the bomb, then we are pretty sure the Saudis will call up the Pakistanis, who are kind of the Avis Rent-A-Car of bombs. And because the Saudis paid for the Pakistani program, they'll probably say, hey, Abdul, I need a couple of weapons over here. And they'll fly them over, probably in a C-130 that we gave the Pakistanis.
But the U.S. is negotiating with partners here.
Yeah, it is.
And who apparently have negotiated in good faith. You were one of the senators, the 47 senators who signed the open letter to Iran. A lot of people took that as intruding on the administration as it's negotiating.
There was a lot of...
Should Congress be throwing itself into this?
There was a lot of manufactured outrage, which is part of politics these days. I told Tom Cotton, who was the author of that letter, it's not likely to have any effect, because the Iranians don't even listen to Obama. So if a bunch of Republican senators send a letter to them, it will just bounce off their turbans.
So what happens what happens now in Congress? Are the votes? Would the votes be there to stop this deal? You would need a veto-proof majority to block the deal. Is that possible?
We were going to be working with Senator Corker, who has a very good idea to force this agreement to be voted on by the Congress. Of course, the president does not agree with that because he's sure that he would lose a vote in the Congress, which he would. And recently, when I offered the Kirk Amendment says that if the Iranians cheat, further sanctions would follow to establish the enabling environment for further pressure and negotiation and verification.
So is that the answer then?
I think that is
sort of an assurance, if we agree to, I think that presumes that there would be a deal, we would sign a deal. Would automatic resumption of sanctions be something that would actually work? I
think if we use the vast economic power of the United States, we could bring the Iranians to heel.
Mm-hmm. You look around the greater Middle East, and it seems you either see dictatorships or civil war. Right. In Syria, you see both. It was not that long ago that we were talking about the Arab Spring and the hope for democracy. Why did all that go so wrong?
I would say that the West had set up a little set of tin pot little dictatorships everywhere, like the one in Tunisia that started the Arab Spring. That in the 21st century, I would say the lesson is it's democracy stupid. And with Facebook and YouTube so able to organize people, that the self-immolation of the Tunisian shopkeeper so exploded on YouTube that it took down the entire Tunisian government that had been in power for about 40 years. To have such a lack of social consensus there means that you have no internal legitimacy. Mm-hmm. I would say with the Arab governments now, the reason why they, we have this ridiculous thing about blaming the attack on Benghazi on the First Amendment of the United States, and saying that if only Americans could just not say offensive things. For the administration to blame an entire attack on a U.S. consulate on YouTube is to blame us for using our First Amendment rights. That I would say, thank God the shape of the 21st century is very much in a reflection of our own Constitution. That shot through Google and YouTube is the First Amendment. They are absolutely fundamental values locked in that system. These dictatorial systems cannot handle that.
So the U.S. is largely withdrawing militarily from Iraq. It's trying to withdraw from Afghanistan. The president is now reconsidering
that. I would say, as a guy who served in Afghanistan, I would say maybe in overly dramatic terms, U.S. forces in Afghanistan may have to learn how to say I surrender in Pashtun if we go down to zero. The 10,800 that we have there should remain there. I think that with U.S. air power backing us up, we can probably hold on in Afghanistan. We should not ask men and women in uniform to retake towns that they have shed their own blood to take. In the case of Iraq, I'm very worried. We lost a number of Americans in taking Tikrit, and now we have engaged in another battle to retake Tikrit, in which we're serving as the Air Force for the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. That is really a terrible outcome of events.
Should the U.S. have boots on the ground in Syria?
No. I was against the Syrian operation, and I was glad the president called it off. Mm-hmm. I don't think he realized that by drawing a red line and not respecting it, he is not respected internationally. If you draw a red line, it should be an actual red line.
Should the U.S. then have a more enhanced military ground presence in the fight against ISIS?
I think over time that's going to be required. Right now, in the battle against ISIS, if you look at the statistics very carefully, you'll see that we're only flying 10 sorties a day. Imagine only 10 missions a day, how slow that is. That's basically a little more than an air show over Kurdistan.
I want to ask you about homegrown terror. Joe Walsh, when he was in Congress, he's made some noise about running against you in the primary this time. He got harshly criticized 3 years ago when he said it's here. He said it's in Addison, it's in Elk Grove, it's in Elgin. Yeah. And yet now we have charges against a teenager in Bolingbrook. The U.S. says that 150 U.S. citizens have tried to enlist with ISIS. how much of a concern and issue is homegrown terrorism?
Pretty heavy concern. We have seen the WGN from Tribune Company already reported on a Facebook post from ISIS where they had a paper mache case where in Arabic it wrote right in front of the 630 North Michigan Avenue, the old Republic building. It said the soldiers of ISIS were here and will one day return. For us to think that we're immune from terrorism right here, you know, Chicago doesn't work at all if we have a terrorist laydown. Think about the almost busiest airport in America and the second tallest building in North America. Those are prime targets that our city economy does not work unless we can secure it. We got to make sure that they cannot hit us in a way that damages our economic potential.
We have a lot to cover, but we do welcome your questions too that we'll get to in a little bit. You were emphatic about Indiana and the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. You said we should not enshrine bigotry under the cover of religion. Has Indiana fixed the problem now? And
they say they have.
Now, Illinois has a Religious Freedom Restoration Act. Were we enshrining bigotry when we passed it?
I actually don't know the details of how Governor Pence tried to fix the law. I will look much more in detail at it. I would say that having a law which allows people to discriminate against other Americans because of a claimed religious feeling is not appropriate for the economy that we want to bring into this country.
Mm-hmm. So what does that say about the Republican Party, which passed it and is leading the drive?
I would say they were, in my view, this is not a shock to you, I disagree with the Republican position.
But again, is there no place for a law that attempts to protect religious freedom? Can it not, does it fundamentally run afoul of protection of individual rights?
Let's back up for a second. I'm about to write an op-ed for you.
Good.
That will make the argument that societies with diversity and toleration tend to be much more militarily strong, on the example that happened here in Chicago when Mussolini copied Hitler by putting in a set of Nuremberg laws in Italy. One lady was really afraid and she left, and she was married to Enrico Fermi. And because she needed to leave Italy, he came to the University of Chicago. Because he came to the University of Chicago, the German attempt at building a nuclear reactor failed. Our attempt at building a nuclear reactor succeeded. So the difference in the critical difference in the Manhattan Project was made simply because of anti-Semitism in Italy, in this country. There is Victor David Hansen writes a book, it's called Of Culture and Carnage. It refers to the amazing record of soldiers of democracies who tend to fight to the last man. Because this is from Greece on against the Persian Empire, because of the shared social bond between them. If you look at military history, as I have as a naval officer, the record of the U.S. military, we are the most lethal military that ever deployed. I would ask in the audience if we could have all those who are veteran stand up. Let's have our fellow veterans stand up for it now. And that applies even to Marines in the room. I will share with you one inter-service joke. You know what Marine stands for? It stands for no. Muscles are required. Intelligence is not essential. Yeah.
So your party, though, a lot of people have said, and they look at Indiana and said, well, this is the fight within the Republican Party.
Right.
You've got, all right, you have Rand Paul running. You have Ted Cruz running. You have a number of people who are going to jump in. So who's your template? What does the Republican Party need in a presidential candidate to get past that civil war that seems to be?
I would offer my own brand, which is to be a fiscal conservative and a social moderate and national security hawk, to make sure that we balance the books and protect the country.
So who's that candidate?
Probably Lindsey Graham.
And will do you expect that he will?
I think he's been playing with it because he's great on national security.
Would you support him? Would he be your
For
candidate?
Rand Paul, I have agreed with John McCain's criticism of Rand. Rand is too much of an isolationist. He's been talking about ending all foreign aid. I think supporting our allies is the cheapest way to handle a situation overseas, rather than sending our own troops.
So we've spent a lot of time talking about things overseas. You're right in the thick of that. You've got an election coming up.
I do.
You've declared that you're going to run. I go back long enough to remember 1984, Chuck Percy, an esteemed senator,
Right.
and yet he was vulnerable and eventually lost to Paul Simon. And one of the arguments was that he was a senator to the world, not to Illinois. Are you vulnerable on that question?
For me, Chuck Percy, I remember during those days, it was tough to get him to talk about Illinois. In my case, I just spent the last couple of days in Peoria, which I will say, can I divert for a second?
Sure.
You guys want to hear something great about our state? A lot of times on the Senate floor, people come up to me and said, hey, Kirk, you're the only senator here from a state where one governor can turn to the other in a prison cafeteria and say, you know, Gov, the food was a lot better when you were running the place. To get that post-Blagojevich feeling, since my stroke, I've been really studying the economic history of this state to make us proud again. So let me ask the esteemed, educated audience, where was the cell phone invented and by who? It was invented by Martin Cooper in Winnetka. The very first cell phone call in the world was made from Soldier Field. And you'll pick up on the theme here. Where was the vacuum cleaner invented?
Who said Missouri? No.
Yeah. And modern dentistry was invented in Jacksonville, Illinois. The guy who would actually drill out cavities and cover them with amalgam, G.V. Black. And we think about, and lots of times the southwest suburbs say, hey, Kirk, tell them all that we invented the zipper. Peoria will say, hey, tell them that we invented the electric blanket. I said, yeah, you guys did. When we think about our economic history of innovation and really changing the world, I will take out my iPhone. This, I'm told, is the most manufactured good in the world today. 76 million of these. The phone transmitter in it was pioneered in Winnetka by Martin Cooper when he was working for Motorola. The web browser that ignited the dot-com boom was invented in Champaign, Illinois by Mark Andreessen when he launched Netscape. When we think about the entire 21st century economy, it's basically based on this one device, which has got solid Illinois roots. If we continually look back at our roots, I would say that what our past is prologue of innovation and wealth creation. I would say, as a senator for the state, I've been very focused on how I can physically create a new African-American entrepreneurial class in the state, led by some competitions that I've had called Entrepreneurial Idol. I found Sherrod Woods there and his company called 3Net Wise, which I think is right on track to do good by healthcare. 3Net Wise's business model is to approach a Medicaid patient and tell her, here's how you hook up to your blood pressure. And if you could just step on the scale here, then a clean signal goes and report is generated to your doctor. The doctor can say, Poppy's got high blood sugar today. Maybe we got a diabetes issue. In so many issues, if you are managing diabetes really aggressively, you're really lowering healthcare costs. To be able to get this company off the ground has been I wanted to make the entrepreneur Sherrod Woods a hero to everybody. That it's his intellectual capital, his idea, right from Illinois here, to make sure that people who have grown up right in the heartline, right in the center of the country. I would give you one little factoid here.
You also made a big push for a federal response, or at least federal funding, on crime, gang warfare in Chicago, and that was a little controversial too. Now that maybe the tension has died down, what has happened with that?
When Rahm won the election, I called him up. I said, hey, I'm going to need your help spending $20 million that I've set aside to take on gangs of national significance, which I mean to be the gangster disciples. I want to use federal law enforcement, the marshals, ATF, the FBI, to take out the big Chicago crime gangs. That's a huge problem. In the case of the GDs, it's 18,000 members. In that, I would say I am not talking about mass simultaneous arrests. We don't have the logistics to do that. And I think we should, I've sat down with Gary McCarthy at his gang map, which he's kept secret. The reason why it's secret, the gangs would go to war to adjust the map. Yeah. To make sure that the map looks significantly different over time. I think we got to build success upon success. In 1929, the Secret Six got together in Chicago to back federal law enforcement, to take out the entire Capone organization, and we did. I worry that in today's media, naysayers would say, oh, Al Capone is too strong, you can never wipe out the Capone organization. To build a 20th century economy in Chicago, we had to do that. We could not be known as Murder Incorporated.
When you spoke at the City Club last week, you said, you told the audience, if you know anyone who's had a stroke,
Right.
give me their name. I want to call them,
Yeah.
I want to tell them what life will be like, can be like. Would you talk about your own recovery, your struggle, how that may have factored into a decision on whether to run for re-election? But I just think basically people would like to know on a human level how difficult it has been for you and how you feel about recovery.
Pretty tough recovery, because it took out my left leg and left arm. And as you saw from my crawl up here, I'm not winning any sprints right now. Yeah.
How do you feel about where you've come and how much further you can go?
Pretty good. I will tell you that, as you can see, a lot of my verbal skills came back. I'll tell you one war story. I was sitting at a fundraiser with some physical therapists in Washington. They were serving Pinot Grigio, and one day I could feel all of my verbal skills come back almost instantaneously. So I've been only drinking Pinot Grigio since then. Yeah.
It works, huh?
Yeah. There is an important issue where we can ask, how has the stroke affected my service to the state? I have put together a bill called the Stroke Agenda, based on the daunting numbers where we see about 700,000 people will suffer a stroke this year. 75% will never return to work after that stroke. If I can get roughly 350,000 Americans to return to work, then any stroke agenda will automatically pay for itself in a renewed tax revenue with higher incomes. As everybody knows, if you're sitting around sick watching TV, you're in pretty low health status. If you're back at work, you got your dignity and power back. Your health status is going to be much better. I've been working with the National Institutes of Health to see if we could set a national goal of returning stroke victims to work, to make sure that they go back to work with higher status and feelings about, and higher incomes.
If I may ask, what was the most difficult moment? What was the biggest critical challenge?
The toughest moment for me was when they loaded me in the ambulance from Lake Forest Hospital to go downtown. At that point, my doctor said, this is looking dicey. And I held on. I had a female tech in the ambulance with me, and I held her hand really hard because I wanted to hold it, have the whole hand holding of another human being. Didn't want to. I wanted my last breath on earth to be holding someone else's hand. I was pretty sure that the stroke was taking hold at that point, that I was a goner at that point.
You did?
Yeah, that was hard.